Good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this special Trobe Asia in Conversation event where we will be discussing Dr. Nalin Mehta's recently released book, The New BJP, Modi and the Making of the World's Largest Political Party, published by Westland this year. My name is Beck Strating. I'm the director of Trobe Asia here at Trobe University in Melbourne. And I would like to begin the event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which Trobe University sits. And I would also like to pay my respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who are present this evening. So part of our role here at Trobe Asia is to engage the public in discussion and debate and to deepen our understanding and knowledge of the Asian region. And to that end, I'm really thrilled to welcome two eminent India experts and members of the Trobe community to this virtual Trobe Asia stage for what I am confident will be a rich and insightful discussion. First, we are joined by Dr. Nalin Mehta, Trobe graduate, but also the Dean of School of Modern Media at UPES, an advisor at Global University Systems and a non-resident senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University, Singapore. Welcome, Nalin. It's really a terrific opportunity for us to discuss your book and the extensive research that you have gathered and collected to publish this book on the BJP in trying to understand how it's become such a dominant force in Indian politics. And so before I hand over the virtual microphone, I just want to offer my congratulations to you on the publication of the book. Thank you, Ian, for holding it up. Available on Kindle or all good bookstores. But I'd also like to welcome Trobe's lecturer in Hindi studies, Dr. Ian Woolford, a very good friend of ours at Trobe Asia, and he will be leading the conversation tonight. So welcome, Ian, and you've read the 900 pages very thoroughly. So Nalin has some questions. You've got questions prepared for Nalin this evening, and I'm just really grateful to the both of you for giving us your time today. So without further ado, Ian, I'm going to pass the microphone over to you. I will just say that there will be some time for Q&A at the end. So for audience members, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box as we work through the discussion, and I will come back back on screen to moderate the Q&A later. But for now, I'm going to hand the hosting reins over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Beck. It's good to see you, and thank you, Nalin, for giving us your time today. Well, पहले इस पुस्तक की पब्लिकेशन पर आपको बहुत-बहुत बधाइयाँ और शुभकामनाएं। विषय तो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है और गंभीर भी है, और कितनी लंबी है ये पुस्तक, लेकिन सच कहता हूँ कि पढ़ने में कुछ मजा आता है. It was actually quite an enjoyable read. So really congratulations to you on this book. It's quite an achievement. Yeah. First, look, most of our audience for this interview, I think, is located outside India. So maybe you could actually just begin by telling us who is the BJP and how did you find yourself writing a book which weaves history, detailed interviews with government officials, and some big data analysis into what I can attest is a really engaging 900-odd page volume. So yeah, who is the BJP and how did this project come to be?
Thanks very much, Ian, for your comments, and also to Beck. Delighted to be here. I'm a La Trobe boy, so fantastic to be on a La Trobe platform. Why this book, and firstly, why the BJP? The BJP, for those just joining in on India, is the ruling party in India. It is the party of Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister. It is the party which espouses the ideology of Hindu nationalism. which is very different from the ideology of the Congress, which dominated Indian politics from independence till about 10, 15 years ago. It represents a new idea of India. And in the world's largest democracy, the BJP has pretty much won landslide victories in 2019 in the last general election, and also in the previous election before that in 2014. So it's changed the rules of Indian politics as we knew it, as I grew up with in the years I was growing up in the 80s, which was an era of coalition politics and no one party dominating Indian politics in one way, and therefore not being able to impose its own ideology in any way. So why this book? It's because, see, I've covered the BJP as a journalist. I mean, I'm an academic and a journalist. I've covered the BJP as a journalist for over 20 years. Narendra Modi, particularly, he was a BJP spokesperson long before he became Chief Minister of Gujarat, which was his last job before he became the Prime Minister of India. From the late 1990s onwards, I've covered the BJP. The reason why I wrote this book was because no matter whether you like the BJP or you hate it, and mostly the BJP, people have a very polarizing opinion on it. Mostly we are all prisoners of we all have a view of what the BJP stands for, whether it's good for India or bad for India. And mostly when you make an argument with the BJP, most people have already pre-decided what their views on that are. The problem for me as a political scientist and as a journalist was that, and this was an individual issue, that since 2014, which is the time when the BJP first came to power by itself, in a landslide majority by itself in the Indian Republic, the BJP between 2014 and 2019, or now until 2022, has won more elections than it has lost, or both at the central and at the provincial level, because India is a federal democracy. And also in elections where it didn't win, it did better in those elections than it did before in several states. So why was that happening? That simply could not be happening. That's happening. The core constituency of Hindu nationalism, right-wing cultural nationalism, is a core constituency of 16, 17, 18%. The BJP's great triumphs from 2014 onwards to now, across a whole host of elections, and again, I say they've won more than they've lost. They've had some significant defeats too, including in Bengal most recently, last year. The data showed very clearly that the BJP has been managing since 2014 to attract to itself newer classes of voters, cutting across divides of gender, of caste, of class. And that's what was leading to these victories. The question was, why was that happening? And what was the fulcrum of this shift in the Indian polity? Is it that India was shifting, or was it organic, or was it the BJP that was doing certain things that was leading to this? That was the primary starting point of this book. Let me also say that most books on the BJP, and with all due respect, to me, most books on the BJP either paint the picture of as absolutely as a fantastic picture, that Narendra Modi is some kind of a god who's delivered this whole transformation of the party. You either find hagiographies essentially, or you find extremely critical accounts, and both have great value. But it was not answering to me the question of why are they winning in this manner, and that was the genesis of this book. So I therefore wanted to write a non-partisan account. I wanted to put my own thinking and my own views on ideology aside, to get out of the echo chambers, because many of us, we are all prisoners of our own echo chambers based on what our positioning on divisive political issues is. And I essentially wanted to answer this question empirically, in an as non-partisan way as possible. Of course, you're never free of biases. You'll always have unconscious biases too. So what we did was we went about creating entirely new data sets to understand what was happening. There were three ways that we did research for the book. And it basically came about because sometime around 2017, I was playing with some data with a colleague of mine, who's a data scientist based in Singapore, and what the data was showing us was entirely different from what the dominant paradigm in academic writing on the BJP was showing us on the ground, as well as the prominent discourse in the media was showing. So what we did then was, data can often be misleading. Data can also, if you don't get your data sets right, if you don't ask the right questions, if you don't interrogate the data enough, it can also give you a very either a partial picture or a misleading picture. So what we did was we went and traveled in Gujarat that year, followed by followed by Karnataka, which was the Karnataka election of 2018, which was in South India, and then across the Hindi heartland, the 5 states of the Hindi heartland in North India, which went to elections in 2018 December. And that, so the idea was, let's see what the data is telling us. Then let's go on the ground and interrogate to see whether this is actually happening on ground or not, and why is it happening? Did it actually happen, and why did it happen? And once we tested this model out in across 8 or 9 different elections over a 2-year period, I think we knew we needed to explore deeper to write a bigger story of the BJP. I must say, Ian, and I'll stop here, 80 to 90% of what is in this book is stuff that I did not know before I started looking into this. And I'm a political junkie. I've followed the BJP for 20 years. I read 6 newspapers a day in 2 languages. I'm totally obsessive about Indian politics, and 80 to 90% of the stuff in the book, which came out from the empirical research, from the data gathering, from interviews, and from archival work, is stuff I wasn't, it made me rethink a lot of things.
No need to stop there. I think this is quite fascinating. I wish, Nalin, we had more time to talk about just what you said about people prejudging the BJP, and also this notion of echo chambers. Just as I mean, you're describing me definitely going into the book, although I don't feel like I'm prejudging. I'm actually judging based on a lot of evidence that's been put in front of me, and I don't think you. I mean, you are, and it's very clear in your book that you're an academic. I don't think you really. Do you really think you're a prisoner of an echo chamber? I don't get that sense from you, and so yeah, I just a comment I wanted to make about that. Maybe we can go back to it. Since you mentioned though these tools that you develop, maybe could you just describe what these are? Because this was fascinating to me. It's the Mehta Singh Social Index and the Narad. That was the data mining software that you have, and you make these tools freely available. I've started playing around with them myself. I thought this was a fascinating tool. So what are they? How do you use them in this study?
So thanks very much, Ian, for that. And we will come back to the larger questions. On the data sets, we created 3 new data properties which drove the research for the book. They were made specifically for the research for this book. The first was the Narad Index, which what we did was that we put together every single BJP document published between 2006 to 2019, and we digitized it. And and these are all press releases, party speeches, internal party documents. They have an internal mouthpiece called the Kamal Sandesh, all the stuff in that, the Prime Minister's speeches over periods of time. So this is all offline literature, right? And this is about, so there was something like 11,588 documents, 17.9 million words, speeches, press releases, articles published by their leaders, speeches by the Prime Minister. 230 issues of the Organizer, which is the mouthpiece of the RSS, about 216 issues over a 1-year period of the Vanvasi Kalyana Ashram, which works on tribal areas, which is one of the linked association bodies of the RSS. And we ran an AI-led software on it to see patterns of discourse which the human eye would not normally see, to see what kind of communication the BJP privileges when. Do those patterns remain constant on its core issues, which are issues around Hindu nationalism, or does it talk about other things too? In what proportion? When do these proportions change? But equally, how do these proportions vary between different arms of this ecosystem of the right? Does the BJP communicate differently from the RSS, and does the Prime Minister communicate differently from the BJP? And also, how does it relate to the Congress, which is the main opposition party? So that was purely about seeing communication patterns. That was one. We also, by the way, tracked the social media accounts of 75 political leaders across India, across political divisions, Congress and BJP, over a 2-year or a 3-year period. All their Twitter posts, all their Facebook posts, And we also saw patterns in that. So we were seeing both offline communication and online, and seeing that. The second was the Mehta Singh Index, which I constructed with my colleague Sanjeev Singh. He's the Singh in the Mehta Singh Index. And that basically was because a lot of Indian politics is based on caste. The dominant paradigm in academic scholarship on the BJP essentially portrays the BJP as an upper caste, urban-based party, which is the caricature of the BJP, which was largely true until a few years back. However, what I was finding on the ground when we were traveling anecdotally and so on, this caricature of the BJP and this data. So, for example, the people who run this, the only people who do these data sets of representation are the Ashoka University, the Trivedi Center for Political Data at Ashoka University, which is done along with Christoph Jafferlaw at Sciences and King's College. The data sets that they had were showing something which was not squaring with what was happening on the ground, but there was a data set. So what we did was that we said, let's look at this afresh. Let's do a revisionist view of this. Let's create a new data set, and let's look at this. Let's throw everything out, and let's create a brand new data set. What we did was we looked at 4,415 politicians across 3 decades of politics in Uttar Pradesh. So we tracked from 1991 to 2019, every single across 4 parties: the BJP, the Congress, the Samajwadi Party, and the Bahujan Samajwadi Party, which is the party of the Dalits. We tracked every single candidate they fielded in every single election in UP from 1991 to 2019 in Lok Sabha, in the Lok Sabha polls. After that, we extended that analysis and we said, okay, what they field in Parliament. UP is the most populated state in India. It fields the largest contingent in the upper house, in the lower house of Parliament, 80 Lok Sabha members, 80 members of Parliament. So we tracked every member of Parliament they fielded for election, for parliamentary elections over a 30-year period. But then we said, look, this is only, it can be partial. So we tracked every member of every candidate they fielded, all these 4 parties in provincial elections in 2017. And then we tracked the office bearers of these parties, the caste of these office bearers. And we tracked the people they appoint as ministers in the state over the last 10 years. And then we compared the castes of all of these people. And that is what the Mehta Singh Index was, to see how patterns of representation of different castes have evolved at different levels of political representation. From the people who parties field in elections to the people they give positions of power to, as in they share the spoils of power with when they win elections, to see, is that constant over time? Have they changed? How has the BJP changed? And importantly, how are they changed in relation to people it's fighting against, which are caste-based parties? SP and BSP are caste-based parties in particular, or the parties of social justice. So that was the second one, the Mehta Singh Index. And the third one was Poll Niti, where we put together 218 different dashboards of huge amounts of data across political economy, including from how many shoes are being sold in the economy on a daily basis to mobile phone, data consumption, everything, economic indicators. So there were 8 economic data dashboards, about 100 constituency level data dashboards, and a whole bunch of social media indicators. We put them together, we called it Poll Niti, and that again allowed us to see patterns. So for example, one of the things we did was we used satellite imagery in the Northeast. Satellite imagery we tracked from 2005 to 2019 to track nightlight data, which is often can be used as a proxy for economic development, and there's a whole economic debate around that. How nightlights in the Northeast have changed. Because the BJP often claims that people vote for us because we brought in substantive changes. So we used some of the non-governmental data like this one to cross-check and triangulate what the government was saying.
If I could just emphasize a couple of things you said, just so that make sure that everyone is really clear that a lot of the findings that you get from using these tools really do run counter to what scholarly consensus has been in the past about the makeup of the BJP and BJP supporters. So it's really worth looking at. The other thing I just wanted to stress, even though you're talking about very technical use of data and using AI and all this, and it might sound very technical, if anyone is looking to read the book, you actually present it in a very readable format. So I just wanted to let people know that. I'd love to sort of go back to this. There's a lot here, but I just, in terms of how you use these tools, well, the manner in which you detail how India's Muslims are excluded from the BJP, I really found the implications of your analysis. I mean, this is an area I'm already very troubled about, but I found the implications of the material you present to be quite terrifying, Nalin, for the prospects for basic democratic values. And it's a question you pose at the end of the book and leave open. This is clearly something you're thinking about. I wonder if you could just address how these tools that you use and your interviews and historical analysis, what do they tell us about the place of Muslims under the new BJP from your title? And maybe you could also just, add into this your findings regarding why the BJP does surprisingly well in districts of UP that have relatively large Muslim populations. This was really interesting and also troubling for me.
Thanks. So two things. Before I answer that, it's a good question to ask, and I will answer that. There you mentioned the conclusion where I do raise this at the end. There's also a chapter on Muslims which you mentioned. For a long time, the liberal assumption has been that the BJP is winning because because of the Hindu nationalist wave that India is turning more and more Hindu nationalist, right? And the BJP was largely, like I said, the caricature was right. For a long time, the BJP was an upper caste dominated party. It was the party of urban areas. It didn't have a rural stake. And the BJP has espoused Hindu causes or Hindutva causes, let me be more correct in this, ever since for a long time, especially since the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. Now, why am I calling this the new BJP? The title of the book is The New BJP. This new BJP that I'm talking about is very different from that old BJP. What this book shows is that the reason why the BJP has won more elections than it has lost since 2014 or done better in those elections than it ever did before is fundamentally because it created an entirely new constituency of voters. And who were these new voters who came to it? Firstly, the BJP became in the Hindi heartland largely the predominant party of rural India. And here I'm talking specifically of the 10 Hindi-speaking states of North India, right? And there is a lot of data in the book about that, on that, how it became the primary pole of politics, not just that it's winning, that it became the primary fulcrum of all politics in these rural areas. It didn't lose the urban areas. It's not like it just shifted from urban support base to rural support base. It retained its urban support. It expanded into semi-urban areas, and then significantly in rural areas, it became the primary dominant pole of the polity. Why did that happen? It happened because of three reasons. And the Muslim question here, which you asked, is the fourth pole of that answer. The first is the BJP expanded from being an upper caste party to becoming the most socially representative party by caste in UP and largely in the Hindi heartland, except for Muslims, right? And by that I mean that, as you know, Ian, the BJP again, just as expanded from urban areas to rural and semi-urban areas while keeping the urban support base, it kept its upper caste support base, which was the Brahmin Banya support base. It used to be called a Brahmin Banya party, but it fundamentally became a party of OBCs, of other backward classes, after 2014. An entirely new lot of voters and families came into the BJP post 2014 who are non-Yadav OBCs in UP and non-Jadav Dalits. Largely because, and this is important because, since the early 90s, Indian politics has been defined by a lot of the parties of social justice, the parties who came out of the politics of reservation and what was called the Mandal Commission. The BSP was the party of the Dalits. The Samajwadi Party in UP was the party of the Yadavs and of and of other backward, what the Constitution of India defines as other backward classes. And for those who don't know India, for castes and classes for whom jobs are reserved in government positions, and education is also, seats in education are also reserved. What the BJP did was that these parties often became, over a period of time, the Samajwadi Party became the party of Yadavs, which is one among 75 other OBC classes in UP. The BSP became the party of Dalits, became the party of Jatavs, which is one among the many subclasses of Dalits. What the BJP came and went and told these people was that, look, we were an upper caste party, but you don't have really, you are voting for all these other parties, but you are not really getting a share in the tent beyond voting for them. Come to us, we'll give you a share. Now, you can pull this trick once. You can talk the talk once. What's happened is that what this book shows is that BJP didn't just talk that talk. When these people started voting for the BJP, many of these newer classes, the BJP gave them a share of power, and the data in the book shows how at different levels of representation in its leadership structures, in its governance structures, in its ministerial council of ministers, and so on and so forth. And that is why in this election of UP, now these changes are not irreversible. They can be reversed, but these elections of UP in 2022 show that far from reversing or weakening the classes, the newer classes and castes that came to the BJP, this process of them remaining with the BJP has become even deeper. Its roots have taken more, have become stronger. In fact, the vote base for the BJP in these classes actually increased in 2022. The second thing I want to add, the BJP also added a very significant new women factor. Women in India have, and rural women in India in particular, have never voted for the BJP until recently, in large numbers compared to the Congress, because they're the only two really comparable national parties. What the BJP, since the 60s, when the election commission started giving us gender-based division of how India has voted, there's always been for many years a 12-13% difference in between male voters and women voters. And historically, while men voted significantly more than women, the women who voted largely voted much more for Congress and much less for BJP among the two national parties. Since the early 2000s, that gap started narrowing. But what happened in 2019 was that in 2019 was the first election in Indian history where the women turnout was slightly more than the male turnout for voters. And in precisely that election, where women were voting more than men, in most of the key states of the Hindi heartland, which give you the maximum number of seats, the voting percentage of women for BJP was higher than for any other party. So it was being driven by a gender vote. And this is the creation of a new women constituency. And this was significantly rural. And this is very counterintuitive because some of the greatest opposition to the BJP is led by women leaders in cities. If you think back to the protests around CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, you think back to the protests around the National Register of Citizenship, in many cities of India, some of the biggest protests were led by women's movements, which were urban. So to say that that women are now voting for the BJP in rural areas significantly more is counterintuitive, and it goes entirely against the grain of academic work on BJP so far. But that's what the evidence shows us. And there are reasons why this happened, and the book shows reasons why that happened, and we can talk about that separately. The third thing that happened is that the BJP has built a huge infrastructure, or the government of the BJP has built at the national level, a huge infrastructure of direct benefit transfers. See, every government spends money on development. Some do better, some do worse. The BJP has not increased the spending on development. The spending on development is very similar to what previous patterns of development were. What it has done is that it has benefited from the creation of a new architecture for delivering that welfare spending directly into people's wallets through the mobile phone. Because this has come through a combination of the mobile phone revolution of India, which has been documented very well by scholars from La Trobe, Professor Robin Jeffrey, and Professor Sadaron, who's now at ANU. This combined with the revolution of cheap data. India has the highest data consumption per capita consumption rate in the world compared to North America or Europe or any other region of the world since 2015. Combined with the cheap mobile phone and cheap data and the creation of the Aadhaar system of biometric identity, which by the way was a subject of huge controversy and huge debate, was only enabled because of a judgment by the Supreme Court of India. And by the way, was the idea of the previous government, not Narendra Modi's government. What happened was that the Manmohan Singh government, which preceded Narendra Modi's last government, they pioneered the idea of direct benefit transfers after a huge debate between the different factions of the government. They tested it out in about 51 districts to begin with. The testing started on the 1st of January 2013. The first 7-8 months of the testing was a disaster. So, but by the time they ironed out the chinks in that delivery system, the national elections happened and the BJP, the Congress lost power. The BJP comes into power. Narendra Modi's great political maneuver at that time on policy was, he had opposed much of this system before when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. But in 2014, Narendra Modi, after a meeting with the head of the UIDAI, which is Nandan Nilekani of Infosys, who had built that whole system, they decided to double down on this and they decided to give it full political backing. And the numbers are really interesting. The numbers are, in 2013-14, and this includes the period of Manmohan Singh and Congress regime as well as Modi, 28 national schemes were part of direct benefit transfers. By 2018-19, that number had become 434, which is a 15-fold increase. In terms of money spent, the money went up from, in 13-14, from 7,300 crores to 2.14 lakh crores, which is an increase of 29 times. If you add benefits in kind, it becomes a 49 times increase. And if you look at the number of beneficiaries, individual beneficiaries, that went up from 10.8 crore at that time to 76.3 crore, which is a 7-time increase. Now, these direct benefits, as opposed to building roads or dams or hospitals or what is conventionally seen as development, by putting money into people's pockets directly through their mobile phone wallets, through the creation of a mobile phone and what was then called Jan Dhan, it, I think, helped the BJP mitigate the great discontent of many of the problems we've seen in the last 2-3 years around the coronavirus, around issues around the economy, so on and so forth. Now, where does that leave Muslims? Coming back to your question. In this period, in 14, in 17 and 19, most people think that Hindus, in terms of Hindu and Muslim voting, India has very significant proportions of Muslim voters in several states. Assam is one state, Jammu and Kashmir is another state, now not a state, now a union territory after the abrogation of Article 370. UP is another state. The BJP has been in power in UP, in Assam now, which is the highest proportion of minorities by proportion now for 2 consecutive terms, right? In UP, it is just 2 consecutive terms. In UP, the triumph that Yogi Adityanath's government has had now is historic for psephological reasons. And it is completely out of whack with the historical trend. And why do I say that? I say that because it is the first time since independence that a sitting chief minister in UP has returned to power. In the days of Congress dominance, the Congress returned to power, but each time with a different chief minister. A sitting chief minister didn't return to power. The last time a sitting government returned to power was 37 years ago. And the last time that a government, which is that a party that wins power in UP in a state election got over 40% of the vote was in 1955 or in the late 50s. So now this triumph comes on the back of a huge farmers' agitation, which we all saw, which created headlines around the world. It comes on the back of agitations around the CA and NRC. And it comes around the back of questions around minorities, right? And it comes on the back of great economic distress. Now you still have this victory. Now, one of the reasons why you have this victory is for the reasons I pointed out before, because you created newer classes of voters, which is women, which is other castes and classes which never were in your tent. You created a new social coalition, which is largely rural and is largely of castes that were never with you before. In the Muslim areas of UP and in the Hindi heartland, the data is very clear. the BJP wins more seats than it loses, right? It also gets more vote share often than other parties. That is not because Muslims are voting more for the BJP. That is significantly because of counter polarization. So what happens often in minority dominated areas, and we mapped several of them in Uttar Pradesh and in the Hindi heartland. You look at both UP, you look at the Hindi heartland in general. Across the last 7 or 8 years, BJP has been winning much more in these seats than before. It's not. I mean, it's a dominant player in these seats. Why is that? Because many other parties put up, which is if you look at in UP, you look at BSP, SP, Congress, they would often put up a Muslim candidate. The Muslim vote is typically 40 to 50%, depending on constituency to constituency, from 30% to 60%, depending on constituency, and that gets split. But what happens is that in areas where there are large Muslim populations, the Hindu votes get consolidated and the BJP often ends up winning. That's one. Second, what the BJP has done is that the BJP often used to put up token Muslim candidates. So it knew it would not get the Muslim vote. By the way, the election data from the last election shows that 8 to 9% of Muslims did vote for the BJP. Largely, these were women. And that women vote came after the abolition of triple talaq, which was also a very controversial legislation, which was passed by Parliament to end triple talaq, right? Which is 7 to 8% vote by the CSDS surveys show us that in this UP election. But that's not why the BJP is winning largely more in Muslim areas. It's winning because of counter mobilization. What the BJP has done as a political device is that, see, the BJP from the early 1990s, in the era of coalition politics, often played what was politically correct. It was much more defensive about being positioned as the party of Hindutva, and therefore it would always field 1 or 2 candidates who were Muslims, right? The BJP, by the way, has always had Muslim representation in its highest leadership. In fact, the 3 people who wrote the BJP constitution in 1980, when it was set up as the party in its current avatar, one of them was Sikandar Bakht, who was Muslim. What the BJP did was that from in the 2017 Vidhan Sabha polls of UP, it did not field a single Muslim candidate out of 403 assembly constituencies. In the Lok Sabha election of 2019 in UP, out of 80 seats, it also did not field a single Muslim candidate. It won the majority of these seats. It won a landslide. In 2022 in UP also, it did not field a single Muslim candidate, though one of its allies did field a Muslim candidate. It also won a landslide. Now, here is something which I think what the data tells us is there was a lot of criticism of the move to not field Muslim candidates, right? By the way, in both the Lok Sabha and in Vidhan Sabha, the BJP did make Muslim ministers after winning power, even though it had not fielded a single Muslim candidate. So in Vidhan Sabha in UP, Yogi Adityanath appointed a Muslim minister. In the previous regime, also in this one. In the Narendra Modi's cabinet, you have Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi, Minister of Minority Affairs.
Yeah.
Is that enough? No. But the BJP didn't field. Both of them are, by the way, politicians from UP. So what I want to say is, between early 90s to the early 2000s, it's not like the BJP was fielding significantly larger numbers of Muslims and it made a huge shift. It was only fielding 1 or 2 candidates. It was only doing the politically correct thing of ticking a box by saying, I fielded 1 person who's Muslim. It was tokenism from a political point of view, right? Because it was not giving Muslims representation in a way. Muslim percentage is much higher. It was fielding 1 candidate will not make you representative. What it did was, in 2017, it did away with the tokenism. It decided that the tokenism is hurting us, and politically, we will not do the tokenism. Rightly or wrongly, it did that. And the result was that it won more seats. It won in those Muslim areas and in other constituencies as well. So what did that tell the BJP? Do more of this. And therefore, they repeated that in 2019 and also in 2022.
And this is something you showed quite well in the book, and you've covered a lot here. I do want to let everyone know that everything you've mentioned here these are arguments you explore in detail. I think we have a few scholars of gender here who might be interested to speak with you about your surprise over how women are both the leading critics of the BJP, but also are voting for the BJP in more numbers. I think scholars of gender have quite a bit to say about women's roles in ethno-nationalist movements. A lot you've said there. I want to bring back to your book and the things you've said, though. Following on from this, when you talk about Hindutva ideology, and you mentioned here the phrase you had was the BJP, the most socially inclusive except for Muslims, and this is a phrase that you have in your book as well, so you do address this head on. But when you look at your discussion of Hindutva ideology, you go out of your way to say that the way that Hindutva is deployed by the RSS and the BJP, and you acknowledge they're different now, but the way they're deployed today are different than Hindutva as it was defined in the 1920s by Savarkar and others. And I wanted to pick your brain about this a bit more, because I don't know if I agree with this. It seems like even with Savarkar, there did seem to be room for, your point was that the Hindutva now is more accommodating of Muslims than it wasn't in the past. My sense was with Savarkar, there was still a place for Muslims within India if they were so-called good Muslims who acknowledge the Hinduness of Bharat. And what I get from your data and the way you show this is you say that it's a softer version now almost. I think that's a phrase you use, or you might remember it better, a softer version of Hindutva. Or what I see as something more alarming is again, from the data you show, is the axis has shifted off of Hindu versus Muslim to more of the way anyone who doesn't subscribe to the ideology of the Hinduness of Bharat, of India, can be described as anti-India, as an urban Nakshal, right? And then therefore be placed outside the nation, outside the protection of the law. This is why we see a situation where we have these, what we know are illegal bulldozers in Jahangirpuri being deployed against impoverished Muslims, but also the alarming harassment and violence against not just Muslims, but anyone who doesn't subscribe to this ideology. So given this ongoing violence, and again, I'm taking this just from little pieces that you have, why is it that you wanted to put forth this argument that the RSS, the BJP, that their version of Hindutva is somehow softer, somehow different? Why was it important for you to frame it this way?
Okay, so to be clear, I'm not making a value judgment on whether BJP, RSS views on I don't represent the RSS. I'm not a spokesperson for them. And I certainly am not an ideologue. I'm not judging the registers of change for RSS. What I'm doing is documenting what they're saying themselves to show that there is a trajectory of change in their own discourse, right? We did not, I mean, for example, Jahangirpuri that you mentioned, the bulldozers you mentioned, all of those have happened now in 2022, including in the Yogi Adityanath government. Now, that chapters which are specific to the RSS are specific to RSS communications as espoused by the officials, spokespeople, and in press conferences and speeches and so on and so forth. Now, what do I mean when I say that the RSS has changed its registers? What I meant was that, very simply, are there issues around, for example, you've mentioned Jahangirpuri. There were also Ram Navi processions where there was violence just a few days back. There was also the issue of hijab in Karnataka, which led to a lot of debate around question of secularism and communalism. There was also the debate on Chatka meat versus halal meat in Karnataka. I've just come back from Karnataka, speaking to a whole bunch of politicians from the Congress and from the BJP, trying to figure out what really was happening here, right? Is it why are leaders not acting on this? Why are these statements being made? What is the pattern of reaction and counter reaction that you're seeing? The chapter in the book which talks about the RSS ideology is very specific to the works published by RSS leaders. And what do I show? What I show is very simple. Fundamentally, for Golwalkar, who was the Sarsang Chalak of the RSS, the second Sarsanchalak, who wrote "We or Our Nationhood Defined" in 1939, which first came out soon after he became the Sarsanchalak and succeeded Hegdewar. That book has got very specific things around Hindus and Muslims and the fatherland, those whose fatherland is outside this country, and so on and so forth. What the RSS did, and this has been documented, and that's what the book shows, in 2006, the RSS officially disowned that book. Now, I'm not saying that changes that changes the fact that there's violence on the ground and there are people who are extremists and who take extreme position on various things. What I'm saying is, academically, it's important to note that not only did the RSS disown that book, they issued a press release for it. They held a whole press conference to announce why they are disowning this book. And what did they say? They said, we are disowning it. Now, you believe them whether this was or not, that's a different question. I'm documenting what they said. What did they say? They said, we are disowning it for two reasons. One, that this book is not Golwalkar's views. It's actually a translation of Mimamsa, which is a book written by G.D. Savarkar, who was V.D. Savarkar's brother, in Marathi. This is actually a translation of that. The book was actually Rashtriya Mimamsa, which means nation worship. One. Two, and for a long time, it was seen as the work of Golwalkar. But later on, he said that actually it wasn't my work. It was the work of G.D. Savarkar. I only translated it. Second, that it represented his views before he became the head of the RSS. Now, that they said this is a matter of fact. Whether you believe, whether they buy this or not, is a matter of opinion, which everybody, you can believe them or diss that opinion. The second was, there was another book by the RSS, by Golwalkar, which is Bunch of Thoughts, which also contained several things which are often quoted in every article on the RSS. The RSS in 2018 also disowned significant parts of Bunch of Thoughts publicly. In fact, the current RSS head, Mohan Bhagwat, did a press conference in Delhi, met a whole bunch of journalists and intellectuals, and specifically talked about this. Now, I think it's important to document that and say that. Now, does it mean that there are issues which the RSS is not supporting on the ground, which people have problems with? No, but they are saying this, right? So all I'm saying is that ideologically, in terms of what they're saying, there has been a shift in bridges. I think it's not just interesting that they were disowning it, they were publicly going out and saying it. And by the way, they were not saying it in the time of the coalition era. They're saying it today when Narendra Modi is in power, when the BJP is in power, right? So that's one. Second, on the question of minorities, you look at the Vijayadashmi speeches of the Sarsanchalak. This is almost like annual speeches. The RSS often doesn't speak publicly at all. But this, on Vijayadashmi, on Dussehra, every year, as you know, the head of the RSS gives a speech. For the last 3 or 4 years, or almost 5 years now, the Sarsanchalak has been specifically talking on the question of minorities and saying what is acceptable to the RSS in its worldview and what is not. What I have done is simply documented what they are saying. And there is a nuance in the utterances of that ideology, which is different from what was written in the 1920s and 30s. Is that replicating itself on the ground or not is a different question. I'm simply looking at the narrative, the official narrative, and the shift in those chapters.
Thank you very much for answering that, Nalin. I think we're about to hand things back over to Beck for the Q&A. There's some time for that. If no one minds, though, I'd like to address one question that's come up in the Q&A. This is from Mr. Ravi Bhatia, who says that it's just Ian who wants to focus on religion and probably caste, as he always does. I should let Ravi know, and Nalin, I hope you would understand I asked these questions because you had entire chapters on them. This was an important part of your book. You developed entire digital tools to look at this because these are some of the most pressing issues of the day. So I really thank you for looking at these, but these aren't things that I'm bringing up. These are things that were right there in the book. It was important to me that we engage with the actual book that you'd written, not the book that we wish you had. So that's why I focus.
So can I say, Ian, that there are at the end of the book, look, the book is very specific to answering why is the BJP doing politically better than it has. And it is doing politically better because more Indians are voting for it for reasons beyond Hindutva. What I'm trying to say is the BJP is not a one-trick pony. It has got several reasons and several registers on why more people are coming to its side. Is it reversible? Yes, it is reversible. So I'm saying the core constituency of Hindutva has not expanded. What has expanded is newer classes of people who's coming in. Also, what has expanded is that for a lot of people, so in fact, one of the guys in the book, one of the key officials from the BJP, he said, and I quoted him, he said, Hindutva gives a speed, and he said in Hindi, Hindutva hame gati deta hai, lekin paiya welfare. Hindutva gives a speed, but the wheel is welfare. And I think the reason why more and more BJP government, I think we need to look very closely at why. See, you can win an election on an emotional roller coaster when religious passions are inflamed. But can you win it again after you've been in power on that same question? When people's livelihoods have been affected in the way we have seen with the coronavirus, our economy has just come, the GDP has just come now to the same size that it was before the first lockdown happened in 2020, right? You've had the highest levels of inflation of WPI and consumer index in the last year and a half, and there's going to be more pain coming with the Ukraine crisis. What I'm saying is, if you have to, whether you like the BJP or you hate it, you have to understand what it's doing on the ground to win. People say, I keep hearing this, oh, this is just an election machine. What they're creating is an election machine. But I'm sorry, the election machine is made of people. You can't just switch a button at 2 months before election and some machine comes up and people automatically vote. There is something else that is happening. The reason why the election machine works is because other things are happening beyond Hindutva. Hindutva is definitely giving power to the BJP, but is not the only reason why it's winning. That's one. The last point I do want to say is that the book concludes with 5 challenges for the BJP. Because that's important. The first is the economy. And I can speak at length about it. The second, I think, is the question of leadership, which is what after Modi, right? One of the challenges, of course, is the question of the Hindu-Muslim divide. How does the BJP deals with these questions going forward on social strife and so on and so forth? That's fundamentally important. And there are 2 other challenges also. There are also one of the challenges is that when you create such a social coalition among Hindus who come into your tent, you are basically like what the Congress was in the 50s minus Muslims in terms of a social coalition, right? When everybody is in your tent, then they will newer classes of people will jostle for more share of the spoils of power. How do you deal with that? In Madhya Pradesh, for example, you look at what's happened in Madhya Pradesh. One of the things the book shows is that in Madhya Pradesh, over 60% of the ministers in Shivraj Singh Chauhan's cabinet were from the RSS. When Jyotiraditta Scindia defected from the Congress and came over to this side, the RSS proportion of that council of ministers went down to 25% roughly. And the Congress guys were given ministerial portfolios. The BJP does this very well, which other parties don't do, by mergers and acquisitions. The entire expansion of Northeast, which is largely Northeast of the 7 Northeastern states are largely Christian states. Assam has got the highest proportion of Muslims by proportion. The other states are 60 to 70 to 80% Christian. How is the BJP winning there in most of those states? Because it is doing the policy of mergers and acquisitions, as explained in the book. What I'm saying is the BJP in different states is a different animal. I think it's misleading to see it as just a one-trick pony. It operates differently at levels of political mobilization than what one would think as a caricature.
And again, I want to stress to everyone that we've really only scratched even the topics that sound like we've talked about in depth. We've barely scratched the surface of the detail that Nalin goes into in the book. It's really quite something. Beck, if you're still here, I'm going to hand things over to you, and I'll thank Nalin myself for answering the questions they have. And Beck, I'll turn it over to you for the Q&A.
Thank you, Ian and Nalin. It's not often in a La Trobe Asia event I get to sit and watch such a fascinating discussion without having to be sort of moderating the events myself. So I feel really privileged to have watched that exchange and to learn a lot from your book and your research, Nalin. We only have about 5 minutes left. I hope you don't mind if we do go a little bit over just to get some questions in, because there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, which I think just demonstrates how engaging the discussion and the research is. So the first one, I might ask 3 and then hand it back to you, Nalin. The first one is one of the questions that I had while I was listening to this. So I'm glad to see it in the Q&A box. And it's, how can we take what the BJP says about their ideology and their official narrative on face value? Shouldn't we critically examine their official narrative based on what they actually do and not just what they say? There's a couple, there's a lot of questions in here. I'll go back up to one that caught my eye in the Q&A. The second one that I would like to ask is, why is the BJP attacking and imprisoning academics, intellectuals and journalists in India today? What are they afraid of? And the third question was about technology. Technology all over the world has been increasingly deployed to push extremist, fundamentalist, racist and misogynistic ideas. Has the BJP not done exactly the same through its armies of trolls? And if it has, is this justified? So I know I've given you a lot of questions there, Nalin, but wondering, one of the things that brings these questions together is a bit of a skepticism about BJP policies and rhetoric. So I'm wondering whether you can respond to these.
Right. So thanks. I mean, we could spend another hour answering each one of these questions, leave alone 5 or 4. The first one, I'm not saying at all that take what BJP is saying at face value. Of course not. Just like anything else, the public domain. I think voters, I don't think, by the way, any voter takes what BJP says at face value. I think voters look at what they are saying and they make their choices. Their choices are, the evidence shows, different from what many liberal intellectuals think they should be. And that's why we think that, they're just buying out like a sinker. Are these voters stupid? I don't think they're stupid. I think people vote for a whole bunch of reasons. Cultural identity is one of them, but I don't think it's the only one. I certainly don't think it's the predominant one for which they vote. That's one. 2, on the question of the BJP's discourse. Look, make no mistake, I'm not saying that the BJP is soft peddling things or not. It's not. In fact, the big difference with the new BJP of post 2014 and the old BJP of Vajpayee and Advani is that this BJP is unapologetic about Hindutva in a way that Vajpayee's BJP was not. Right? Let's be clear about that. But what the Narad Index says, let me explain. Let me be clear on this. It says, what are the core issues of the BJP? The core issues which have always been defined as the core issues: Kashmir, terrorism, the Ram Temple, the Uniform Civil Code. These were traditionally seen as the 4 core issues of the BJP, which made the BJP anathema or to most other political parties in the 90s, when the BJP was looking for allies, when it wasn't big enough to form governments of its own. And the BJP watered down its commitments to many of these to form coalition governments, right? This BJP has doubled down on this. This BJP is completely unapologetic. Article 370 gone by a constitutional amendment. Ram Temple built after a 5-0 judgment, by the way, by the Supreme Court of India, whether one agrees with that judgment or not. On the question of Uniform Civil Code, it's not there yet, but a law on triple talaq was passed, right? What I'm saying is, what the Narad Index, so I'm not saying at all that the BJP has softened its narrative in some way. In fact, it is doubled down and become hardline on its absolutely core to what it's been saying on these core issues. What I am saying is that what Narad Index showed us is that the BJP is not just talking about this. I had thought, as somebody who observed the BJP, because if you see the television channels of India, the prime time debates, those which are left and those which are right, and mostly they are right. There are very few which are left. And if you see the newspaper headlines, you will think the BJP is only talking about these issues. And because that is what dominates the headlines. What the Narad Index surprised me with was that this was just one small sliver of its communications. What it was doing was, in the top 5 issues, for example, Modi's, among the top 5 issues he talks about is about women, outside of any of this. Issues around development, issues around farmers, they are in the top 5. In fact, the most important thing the BJP speaks about is the Congress, even more than Modi. When in its communications over the last 5 years, from 2016 in particular, the BJP has spoken more about the Congress as the ruling party, which is unusual for a ruling party to speak so much about the opposition party, more than it is even spoken about Modi. So it speaks, and the divisive issues, which are the ones which I pointed out just now, those, make no mistake, it is not backing off on those. It is speaking on those very aggressively. But in terms of the volume of what it's saying, what I'm saying is it has got different things it says to different audiences, including on farmers. One of the reasons why you've not had a farmer upsurge of the kind that the protests seem to signify, which were on a television screen all the time, is because the BJP has done huge communications to farmers over the last 5 years, which mitigated the impact of much of this. Where was the farmer agitation? It was largely in Punjab. It was largely in western parts of UP and Haryana. There were many organizations of many states, but there was no mass movement of the kind that we saw in Punjab, where it became a real problem, and it became an issue of izzat and of pride that you have to withdraw these laws, or it became parts of western UP. In other parts, in Karnataka, in Maharashtra, some of the biggest farmer movements did not support the agitation, right? So what I'm saying is there's a lot of communication the BJP does, differentiated messaging to other audiences, which are outside of its issues of cultural nationalism, and we miss that. And that is a major reason why when election results come in these classes or these particular categories of voters vote more for the BJP, we get surprised. Because we think it's a one-trick pony, it's only saying about one thing. It's not. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying agree with what it's saying. I'm not saying accept what it's saying. No, that everybody will make their own judgment on what the BJP is saying.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid that we are out of time, and I'm very apologetic in that we've got so many questions in the Q&A box, which we won't be able to get to tonight, but I think that we will have to have you back for another event, Nalin, so that we can go through some of the other issues that have been raised in the Q&A section. But thank you, Nalin, and thank you, Ian, for that really insightful discussion. Congratulations again, Nalin, on the publication of your book. It's obviously a significant achievement, and you've done an exceptionally large amount of research to produce this book. So thank you. And of course, you're both members of the La Trobe community, so we're delighted to feature you here tonight. I would also like to thank our audience, as always, for joining us for this event and for the excellent questions that you put forward. It's always great to see an audience that is thoroughly engaged in the discussion. Our next scheduled La Trobe Asia webinar is actually this Thursday, 28th of April, where Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar will be launching our 7-week Indonesia in Focus academic seminar series. She'll be sitting down with me to discuss Indonesian foreign policy and bilateral relations with Australia. So please follow us on Twitter at La Trobe Asia, or join our mailing list to find more details for online events and La Trobe Asia publications. But thank you again, Nalin, and thank you, Ian.
Thank
you very much,
Thank you.
And Ian. Thanks very much. I wish we could have taken all the questions. We ran out of time, but there are some very good questions, and I wish I've been able to answer them. But thank you.
Next time.
Nice to meet you, Nalin. Thank you very much, and congratulations again.
Thank you.